There's something you notice about people who grew up in the 80s, a particular way they hold contradictions. They can be optimistic and cynical at the same time, deeply independent but also strangely comfortable with uncertainty. And there's often this quality, hard to name exactly, of being prepared for things to change suddenly. If you know someone born between roughly 1972 and 1982, you've probably seen this. A kind of emotional flexibility that looks like resilience but feels, from the inside, more like adaptation. The 80s were loud, not just sonically, though they were that too, but loud in the sense that the world was talking to children in ways it hadn't quite done before. Through screens, through advertising, through news that didn't filter itself for young audiences. MTV played in living rooms. Cable television multiplied channels. Movie theaters showed films that pushed boundaries. And children absorbed all of it, building a particular relationship with information and imagery that would mark them for life. A child in 1985 could watch the news and see the Challenger explosion, see AIDS discussed in ways that were frightening and often confusing, see homeless people on streets in numbers that seemed new and alarming. The Cold War wasn't abstract. It was in movies like The Day After, in songs, in conversations adults had in hushed tones that children overheard and internalized. This created something specific, a generation that grew up knowing the world was dangerous, but being told everything was fine, that learned to hold fear and normalcy in the same moment, that understood, earlier than they might have otherwise, that catastrophe was always possible, but life continued anyway. What does this do to a developing sense of security? It doesn't destroy it, exactly, but it calibrates it differently. Many people who grew up in the 80s have this quality of expecting the other shoe to drop while still moving forward with their lives. Not pessimism, more like realism with momentum. The ability to plan for the future while knowing the future is uncertain. The independence was still there, though perhaps a degree less than the 70s. Children still roamed neighborhoods, still left the house for hours without parents knowing exactly where they were. But now there was stranger danger. Now there were milk cartons with missing children's faces. Now there were safety assemblies at school, teaching you not to talk to people you didn't know. So you learned a more complicated form of independence. To be free, but vigilant. To trust your instincts. To project confidence, even when you felt uncertain. Many 80s children developed what you might call a performance of capability, looking like you knew what you were doing, even when you didn't, because showing vulnerability felt dangerous in a way it hadn't for the generation before. Latchkey kids. That term defines something important about the decade. Children who came home to empty houses because both parents worked, or because there was only one parent and they had to work. You'd let yourself in with a key you wore around your neck or kept in your backpack. The house was yours for a few hours. You'd make a snack, do homework or not do homework, watch TV, call friends. This created a particular form of self-reliance. Not the self-reliance of outdoor adventure, but the self-reliance of domestic management, of being alone and having to be okay with that, of making small decisions about your own care and safety, of learning that you could survive being by yourself, that loneliness was something to move through, rather than something that required immediate intervention. People who grew up this way often have a complicated relationship with solitude as adults. They're comfortable being alone, maybe more comfortable than generations raised with constant supervision. But there's sometimes something underneath that comfort, a memory of what it felt like to be small and responsible for yourself, to be waiting for a parent to come home while the house got dark around you. The entertainment was different too. Video games were emerging, simple ones, pixelated and repetitive, but utterly absorbing. You'd play the same game for hours, trying to beat your high score to get to the next level. There was no save function in many games. If you failed, you started over. Completely over. This taught patience of a specific kind. The willingness to repeat something until you mastered it. To fail without it being catastrophic. To understand that progress wasn't always linear. Many 80s children developed a tolerance for frustration because their entertainment required it. You couldn't skip to the end. You couldn't look up the answer. You just had to keep trying. And when you weren't playing video games, you were watching movies. On VHS tapes you rented from the video store or recorded off television. You'd watch the same movie dozens of times because you only had a few tapes. You'd memorize entire films, rewind the good parts, fast forward through the boring ones. This created a different relationship with media than what would come later. A sense that content was finite, that you consumed what you had access to deeply, rather than skimming across infinite options. People from this generation often still have this tendency to return to the same books, the same albums, the same films, finding comfort in repetition rather than always seeking novelty. School was changing too. The 80s saw the beginning of what would become high-stakes testing culture, the sense that children needed to be prepared, measured, optimized. But it hadn't fully taken hold yet. There was still time to be bored in class, time to pass notes, time to stare out the window and let your mind wander. Socially, friendships still required physical presence. You called your friend on a landline, and their parent might answer, and you'd have to talk to them, politely, before asking if your friend could come to the phone. You made plans days in advance because there was no way to coordinate in real time. If someone didn't show up, you just waited, and then went home. This taught something about commitment and follow-through, about managing expectations, about the fact that sometimes people let you down, and you can't know why until you see them at school on Monday, and they explain, or don't explain, and you have to decide whether to forgive them or stay mad. The peer pressure was intense, but it happened in person. The social hierarchy was visible and immediate. You knew where you stood. You could see who was popular, who wasn't, who was moving up or down the social ladder. It was often painful, sometimes cruel, but at least it was contained. When you went home, you got a break from it. There was no social media to extend the judgment into every hour of the day. What this created was a kind of code-switching ability, the capacity to present differently in different contexts, to be one version of yourself at school, another at home, another with your neighborhood friends. Not inauthenticity exactly, but adaptability. The understanding that social survival sometimes required flexibility. The music was everywhere. Not in your pocket, not on demand, but on the radio, on MTV, on your Walkman if you were lucky. You'd wait for your favorite song to come on the radio so you could record it on a cassette tape, your finger hovering over the record button, hoping the DJ wouldn't talk over the beginning. This waiting, this hoping for a specific moment of connection with something you loved, it built a relationship with desire that was different from instant gratification. You wanted things and didn't get them immediately, and the wanting became part of the experience. The anticipation. The moment when the thing you'd been waiting for finally arrived. And then there was the broader cultural message of the decade. The aggressive optimism. The idea that you could be anything you wanted to be if you just tried hard enough. That America was morning again. That the future was bright. That technology would solve problems. That prosperity was possible for everyone. Many 80s children internalized this message deeply. But they also, because they were watching the news, because they were latchkey kids, because they could feel the anxiety in their parents, knew it wasn't quite true. So they learned to carry both narratives, to be hopeful and skeptical, to strive and doubt, to believe in themselves while also preparing for disappointment. This is perhaps the defining psychological characteristic of the generation: the ability to hold opposing truths simultaneously, to be independent and anxious, free and fearful, optimistic and realistic. It's not cognitive dissonance exactly. It's more like psychological bilinguality, fluency in multiple emotional languages at once. As adults, people who grew up in the 80s often seem remarkably steady in chaos. When systems fail or circumstances change suddenly, there's a part of them that isn't surprised, that remembers learning early that the world was unpredictable, that absorbed stranger danger and the AIDS crisis and economic uncertainty and the threat of nuclear war, while also being told to smile and be positive and believe in the future. They learn to be resourceful when alone, to entertain themselves when bored, to persist when frustrated, to adapt when circumstances shifted, not because they were especially strong or special, but because those were the skills their environment required. And they learned something else too, that you could know the world was complicated and frightening and still find joy in it, still play, still laugh, still connect with friends, still lose yourself in a movie or a song or a video game. That survival wasn't just about being tough. It was also about being able to find lightness in the weight. The 80s are often remembered through neon colors and synthesizers, through movies and fashion that now seem charmingly dated. But underneath that bright surface was a more complex experience. Children growing up in a world that was changing fast, that was telling them contradictory things, that gave them freedom but also fear, that promised them everything while showing them that everything was fragile. What remains in the people shaped by that decade is hard to summarize neatly. It's not one thing. It's a constellation of capacities and contradictions. The ability to be alone without falling apart. The tendency to prepare for worst-case scenarios while hoping for the best. The comfort with change, because change is what they learn to expect. If you're watching this and you recognize yourself here, maybe you're understanding something you felt but couldn't quite name. And if you're watching to understand someone else, a parent, a friend, a colleague, maybe you're seeing now why they are the way they are. Why they can seem so steady and so anxious at the same time. Why they value independence but also crave connection. Why they can be optimistic realists. The world keeps changing, but the people shaped by the 80s carry something forward. A particular kind of resilience that isn't about never feeling afraid. It's about feeling afraid and continuing anyway. About holding contradictions without breaking. About knowing the world is uncertain and still finding a way to be okay in it.